Thank you, Burak, for let me. So thank you, Burak, for having me, and it's a pleasure to have a conversation with you. So my name's Mike Quinn. I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. As the son of two high school teachers as parents. I had zero connection to Africa or entrepreneurship, actually, even in my family. Um, but I think my parents gave me a very strong social values, and actually seeing them like work in the public sector and be teachers, and the passion they had for that, I think was very influential in my early life. Did engineering as an undergrad degree, and that was a huge turning point for me because I didn't actually enjoy it. I wasn't very technical, but I finished the degree and joined an organization called Engineers Without Borders. That This was the last year of my undergrad degree. That was sending young engineering graduates to Africa on like 1 to 2 year long volunteer placements. And I ended up going to Ghana with them for a year back in 2003, working on a rural agriculture project, and never really turned back after that. I did a second placement with the same organization with Engineers Without Borders in Zambia for a year and a half. And this was early career, like in the development sector. But I was starting to realize like the entrepreneurial flair I think I had, because it was very young organization, but they would partner with us with like local NGOs on the ground, and we had a lot of freedom and flexibility, and a really good community of other volunteers. But I learned a lot about poverty. I saw the opportunities everywhere, and but I was also realizing that the development sector I wasn't gonna be able to achieve the impact that I thought was possible, and I had a lot of questions at that time. So after 2.5 years of volunteering in the development sector, I went to the UK, did a 1 year master's in international development, and then I got a very lucky break where I got into the MBA program at Oxford University as a scholar for social entrepreneurship. Um, and it was at a time where social entrepreneurship was a buzzword, and people were asking, what does it even have to do in a business school? To be honest, I don't think very many people even applied for it. I would never have got in today with the skills I had at the time, but I was kind of very early. Like timing was really lucky for me, but that was really what lit the spark for me, because then I used that year in business school to really think about, how do I become an entrepreneur and start a business? And my criteria were I wanted to move to Africa, commit to something long term that could make a difference. And I ended up meeting a whole bunch of investors through my MBA that kept talking about how they wanted to invest in local entrepreneurs in Africa, but they didn't have deal flow. And this was at a time like impact investing was not a word yet. It was like 2008. And I put my hand up and said, that's a problem I can solve. And I managed to convince one investment fund to buy me a plane ticket to go back to Zambia to find entrepreneurs they can invest in. And my pitch to them was that I will stick around and help you build the business. And I met these two brothers who were just coincidentally founding one of the very first fintechs on the continent. And a series of like my life is just like a series of lucky events, like one after the other. And they were very early stage, and they had no idea that any investors from outside of like their so small network would be able to, like, and especially from global investors, would want to invest in their business. They thought that maybe they could get this product going, and then a local bank would want to buy it or invest into them. But I was able to bring this U.S. investor, and we closed what was probably the first seed round in the fintech sector in Africa back in 2009. Then went through a wild series of ups and downs, and ended up closing again what was probably the first Series A in the fintech sector in early 2012, which was led by Pierre Omidyar's Omidyar Network, and Pierre Omidyar was the eBay founder, and Axion, which has since spun off a global fintech fund called Kona Capital. So I'll pause there, but it was like that. That's how I got my start, and how I got to my first company.
You wrote a book. What inspired you to write this book, reflecting on your experiences building Zoona? Or what do you think that it is the most important takeaway you want also these after reading your book? Your
Yeah.
book name is Failing to Win: Hard-Earned Lessons from a Purpose-Driven Startup. So you also shared your failures.
Yeah, so maybe I'll give you a little bit of the arc of what happened at Zoona, this first company that I co-founded in Zambia. So um, I very quickly, after we got the investment, and I started working with the two brothers who are the original founders. They asked me to become the CEO, um, and they they were brothers, so I was facilitating decision making a lot. Let's just put it that way, and I had the investor relationships. And we kind of crystallized this vision of a cashless Africa, of like, how do we actually, now we can get this investment. How do we scale this thing? And I did two other things. One was I had a personal connection to the then CFO of Google, who came in as an early angel investor. And he happened to be the early chair and first investor of Engineers Without Borders that I volunteered with. So I was able to keep that relationship warm. And then second, I convinced my parents to mortgage their house and lend me $100,000 to go all in on the business. This was probably the scariest thing I've ever done and the hardest pitch I've ever made to any investor. But I was like knee deep in student debt, and I had no savings. Luckily, my fiance and then wife kind of had a stable enough job to pay rent. But I wanted to really be a partner in this business, and that was the moment where my co-founder Brad would always say, when you have bacon and eggs for breakfast, the chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. And so he would say that was the moment I became pig and actually became a co-founder, and then the CEO of the business. And we had lots of ups and downs, but it was like generally trending up, and we hit the hockey stick curve growth. Probably a year and a half after we closed the Series A investment. And at our peak, we had scaled to serve, we were actively serving a quarter of Zambia's adult population, so about 2 million monthly active customers. We were processing $60 to $70 million a month of money transfers. We expanded successfully into a second market next door in Malawi, and had visions of really going big. And where the story diverted was the last few years was really, really tough because first the macro environment shifted. So we started experiencing big headwinds in the form of like currency devaluations, lots of operational challenges on the ground that were like linked to the market. We had like a cholera epidemic, which was, everybody in the world now knows what a pandemic is with COVID. But we experienced this in Zambia when like the market went into lockdown because of a cholera epidemic, and then our whole business like had to shut down for like a few weeks. And I remember trying to explain this to my board, and it was like very, people didn't actually have that reference point of like, what do you mean? Like, these agents can't trade and people aren't sending money anymore. But what really, I think, crippled us, we ended up raising a big Series B. We had a failed expansion into a new market, and realized like that going country to country in Africa wasn't as simple as it was in like an investor pitch deck. The operational challenges and the complexity of that expansion was much harder than we anticipated. We didn't design it very well. And then at the end, we had a big investor pull out at the very last second, like after 4 months of due diligence, of what was a $40 million Series C round. That ended up being the thing we couldn't recover from. We at that point we had a very strong business in Zambia and Malawi. We were facing increasing competition from some telcos, but we were evolving into what would have become like a digital bank for Southern Africa, and we needed a lot of capital to fund that business plan. And the investor actually pulled out for a lot of reasons that were due to them, a shift in strategy and a shift in management team that, that I won't go into. But also the reflection was, we were in a small market trying to raise a lot of money, like well ahead of our time. And it was a hard sell to get, investors to pour in like tens of millions of dollars into a Zambian business competing against telcos, with kind of a limited market size. And that became what was probably the hardest period of my life, because the 9 months after the deal fell apart, the only thing we could do was slash costs. And any founder will know that when you actually are cutting costs in your business, you accelerate your cash burn, because you have to pay severances to people, and the morale of the company collapses. We couldn't drop pricing in the market when the competition was increasing, because we would have been bankrupt instantly, because we no longer had the investment coming in. Our early investors were kind of tapped out and couldn't put any more money in. No new investor would touch us because there was no lead in the round. And they were all asking us, like, I thought your deal was going to close. And so, yeah, it was an extremely difficult time. We had like 250 staff at that point, right? So it was a proper company. But I ended up leaving in May 2019, just under like about a year after the investment round collapsed. And we ended up doing a deal with our kind of shareholders to put in a bit more money. Our lenders would convert some of their debt to equity, and we would shrink the business down into like a really small team, and then spin out a new like B2B strategy. And so the original vision of our company was no longer, but there's still like a kernel there, and a technology and a strategy and like a lot of relationships that we felt had value. And it was a natural time for me to step aside. In hindsight, I probably should have done it a bit earlier. But yeah, coming to your question of, I didn't actually set out to write a book. I just left this extremely intense experience for 10 years. Like every day was intense, but the last year was like extra intense, where I wasn't sleeping. It was hard to be present with my kids. It was just like nonstop stress and pressure. And then suddenly I was like all by myself. My emails stopped. I wasn't in meetings anymore. I just like, I could drop my kids off at school. My wife was at work, and then I'm like, what do? I'd go for a hike or a run, because I was living in Cape Town at the time. So I got to experience the nature a little bit, but you can't exercise for 8 hours a day every day. And I would tell this story that I've told you, but I actually, if I shared it with anybody, I would be in tears, and like the emotion was so raw. And I was thinking at the time, I'm like, geez, like we failed to win, and like I really felt like a failure. Like I was the CEO of this business. I'd sold this dream of like a cashless Africa. We had raised $35 million, before the round collapsed, of other people's money that didn't have a hope of getting paid back. So I really felt like a failure. And I had the title, like I remember being on a run and I was like thinking about this, and I just wrote it down when I got back. And I had a lot of encouragement from both my wife, but also other founders that I would talk to, who I would tell the story of kind of, everybody's like, what happened at Zoona? And I'd share some of the stories, and it would be like, people would respond saying, that's really intense. But then they would reciprocate with an experience that they had with their board, or an investment round collapsing, or a failed product launch. And then I started to realize that nobody actually talked about failure, even though everybody experienced it. And so that was the inspiration to actually start writing. And I always enjoyed writing. My mom was like an English teacher, high school English teacher, her whole career. And so I had this time, and I started writing. And what I learned, probably a few things. One was, I'm like, where do I start? And I wanted to, like, the end was very raw, but I actually started at the beginning. And that was an amazing, gave me amazing perspective, because I had to really go back in my own mind, and then like search emails and start having some conversations about like, how did I even get to Africa in the first place? And how did we start the business? And how did we get it off the ground? And that was just like a flood of like happy memories. And as I wrote this, I kind of was getting over like the what happened at the end and just remembering like the good times. And the more I carried on with like the story, just chronologically, I started to realize like, you know what, we didn't actually fail. We were like winning the whole time, but all of the success we had was a series of like fail, 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 and then like a milestone or a win, right? And it was just like this iterative process. And it was like becoming CEO. It wasn't like I was born as a CEO. I was like, one day these two brothers are like, hey Mike, why don't you be the CEO? And I said, okay. Right. And then we fought for the next 3 years, and there was no written down like job description or formal transition plan. I didn't have any coaching early on. So it took me a long time of like figuring that out. And like, managing a board. The first time we got in the investors, we had huge fights between like founders and the board. And everybody's looking at me saying like, Mike, you need to sort this out. And founders are like, Mike, you're aligned with us. And the investors are like, we backed you, Mike. So like, you need to sort out the founders. And so I was always kind of pulled. And then eventually I kind of figured that out. And so when I had this like whole story written down, I like felt a lot better. B, realized that like even though we failed to win in the end, it kind of took on this new meaning of like failing in order to win. And then like C, I had like such a crystal idea of what I wanted to do next, because now I had written this down and like also reflected on like what I would have done differently. And then I would like took out a piece of paper and I had a new business. And it was just so clear to me. And I didn't know exactly what it was, but I was like, I knew how I would do it differently. Right. And like the principles of like, starting a business designed for multi-country scale, asset zero, headcount light, capital efficient, to not depend on lots of investors, solving a big problem and a common pain point across lots of different markets. And at that point, I should accelerate my story a little bit here, but I remember thinking, I'm like, okay, the book's done. Now I'm back to being an entrepreneur. And then I started sharing the manuscript, and everybody's like, you need to publish this. But that became probably the less fun part of writing the book, because I realized that like it ended up going through like a probably 18-month editing process and required several rewrites to shape it from like my personal diary to like a book that like founders and other entrepreneurs could read and get value from. And as I was doing that, I was starting a new business. COVID happened, so like working in lockdown with kids not going to school, and then my family moved from Cape Town to London because my wife got a new job. So it was like another really hectic time, but it ended up being all worthwhile. And yeah, just really happy that the book got published and it's got some great reviews, and people like you have read it. And I got a lot of messages from founders about how much it's helped them and how much they relate to it. And then, my new business Boost is off the ground and thriving at the moment. So
after 10 years of Zoona, I mean, what motivated to start something new with Boost? For those less familiar, how would you describe the Boost mission and the problem you aim to solve?
Yeah, let me answer those questions separately, because I think the first one is this exact same question my dad asked me, but it was more, why the hell would you want to do that again? Once he actually read the draft of the book, my parents, because they knew I went through ups and downs in Zoona, but like when they read what I wrote down, they were like almost like hurt, and like they're like, I can't believe you experienced this, and probably felt helpless a little bit. And yeah, and then naturally for me, so as an entrepreneur, I do think part of it is being born an entrepreneur. It's like it's no longer a job for me. It's like it's who I am. So I never thought for a second about doing anything else other than starting a new business. I had to people were slowing me down and saying, take a break and make sure you don't do anything too quickly or too rash, which was great advice. But I knew I was going to start again. It was just a question of kind of what and when. And I knew it was going to be in Africa, because I'm it's like, you know what, I'm committed to this continent, and it would be a shame to have all this experience and then not actually try again and do something bigger and better, and more impactful. Um, but yeah, that was the motivation for me. And then the book and the reflections really kind of, and like really going deep into what happened, why did it happen, what did I learn from it, and how would I do things differently next time. That was my process I had to go through, and writing it down was very helpful. And that gave me the idea for Boost, right? And so what Boost is now, is we are a B2B commerce platform that is partnered with manufacturers like Unilever. They're our anchor partner. We're working with them across several markets in Africa, and helping to digitize their distribution network at the last mile. Because the way that the supply chain works in Africa, and the majority of probably emerging markets, and even some more advanced markets, is Unilever will see the distribution at the first level of like their really big distributors, but then products that they sell, like toothpaste and soap, like all these essential goods, get redistributed from a top key distributor to a smaller wholesaler or sub distributor to a smaller retail shop, and then sold to the consumer. And all of that redistribution happens offline, mostly in cash. And it is in Africa, it is the market. They call it general trade, or like the informal economy. But it is like 90% of where people shop, right? So there's no visibility for the manufacturer. There's no ability to push promotions or build a relationship with like the retailers that are their point of sale to consumers. But then the distributors and wholesalers that are the ones that are actually moving the products and playing this critical role of like interfacing between Unilever or like their large key distributors and the last mile shops, generally run their businesses on pen and paper. And these are also family owned businesses, generally husband and wife, like a small warehouse, maybe like 10 motorbikes or some tricycles or vans or trucks to move products around. So they do distribution, but thousands and thousands of these distribution businesses don't have any technology, and therefore also struggle to manage inventory, orders, customers, reconcile cash. And so Boost has built a platform to really solve this problem. And think of like a Shopify for distribution in Africa and one day all emerging markets. And so the platform is used by distributors or wholesalers to digitize like their entire business, from registering the customers they supply, end-to-end inventory flows, payments, and orders. And then it provides a data layer for Unilever and manufacturers to plug into to see what products and SKUs are being sold when and where, and then the ability for them to also push promotions to the retail point of sale. And for the retailers at the end, we have a very simple ordering product. So we kind of have, every customer in the supply chain, we have a product for. And again, like Shopify, I love their business because they build tools. They believe in entrepreneurs, and they build tools to enable them to digitize, to sell online, to grow their businesses, to plug in payments, to do order fulfillment, to plug in capital, to have business support and analytics and insights. So we're trying to create this at Boost and doing it across many markets. And just taking a step back, I didn't have that specific idea, but when I left Zoona and after having written the book, but I knew how I wanted to do it. And this should actually be my next book, of like the importance of like starting with the how. I know Simon Sinek has a great book, Start with the Why. Like I really believe start with the how. And the principles, first principle was to focus on a really common problem that is across all markets. And I knew, retail and the last mile distribution in Africa, there's 100 million like micro, small retail businesses. that are offline and order and pay for their stock in cash and like buy goods out of a van or at a market. And so digitizing that like kind of last mile between like distributors and retailers, I knew was a problem that could scale everywhere. And the kind of purpose behind that is then the ability to help these small businesses become part of the digital economy, which is critically important because it drives GDP growth and job creation. So that's really the purpose and mission behind the business. And then figuring out like we could do this in a way that we can make money and then could scale the business and be attractive for investors. So that was principle number one of focusing on that problem. Number two was designing the business for multi-country scale from scratch. And this was really important because starting with the technology, my co-founder, Will, our CTO, when I recruited him, I outlined this and said, we need to build a platform that can very easily launch into any market, work in any currency, in any segment, and it's got to be able to be adapted locally, but it needs to be the same everywhere. And I had an image of like a WhatsApp image where like customers can order and then get like financial services on this. Like I just did a mock image for my very first deck. And Will was like, that sounds like a great problem to solve. And I'm really proud to say that we were in our 6th country before he hired our 2nd developer. So Will went out and built this. And again, it was because we were solving a similar problem where ordering has to work the same way, managing distribution has to work the same way. But then it was, we built very simple ways of changing the language. So we're in English, French, Spanish, Arabic right now. And we work in different segments. So FMCG and Unilever is our anchor, but we have distributors and wholesalers that work in food, agriculture, even one that does cleaning supplies. So we kind of tested in different segments and validated like the scalability around that. And then now we can actually create an instance for a customer anywhere in the world. So it's becoming around the strategy of where do we want to go and who do we want to partner with. The tech is solved. And at Zoona, we did not have that luxury, right? We had a fairly good sized tech team, but by the time we went into our 2nd market, we almost had to like rebuild a new system. And then we were running parallel systems, and because it wasn't designed for scale. So with Boost, we did that. And then on the whole business model was optimized for this. So again, thinking in the early days around, well, if we get involved in the distribution ourselves, then the complexity will be too great and we'll never be able to figure out how to do this across multiple countries. So how do we find the distributors and just be enablers and make sure we're not ever in the supply chain? We are enabling the existing supply chain that happens. How do we do this in a way that's as asset zero as possible, not even asset light, but critically headcount light? Because if we're going to be in multiple countries, we need to make sure that we have really small teams and each person needs to be outstanding and experienced at their job. And then that means that we can run faster. There's less time getting aligned. It's an easier challenge to like build a shared culture across a lot of different markets. And then that kind of led us to another challenge around, well, how do we do this during COVID? And how do we recruit founders? And we designed like a really innovative model of having country level franchises where in each market we go into, we're not hiring a general manager or a country director. We're actually recruiting an experienced operator who can become a co-founder of that business. And then, we provide them with like the platform, the capital, the tools, the brand, the partnerships. But then we have like, entrepreneurial operators who are actually making it work on the ground. And then doing this remotely, we have to figure out how to bring everybody together and share this culture. And that's now become a big part of my job, right? Is connecting everybody together. And we've developed like a shared set of virtues, principles, and norms for how we work together and what our shared strategy is. And the acceleration of this is amazing because now, our teams in Egypt are calling our team in South Africa, and they're having conversations to solve problems together around like acquisition. We're seeing the models in very different markets like have really common threads. And initially, everybody thinks, oh, these markets are so different, which they are. But the process of business building is very common. Founders experience the same challenges no matter what business they're building in whatever market. It's kind of the same steps and challenges you have to overcome. And then if you're trying to solve the same problem in every market, the market's different, but the problem's the same, right? So we develop different solutions, but we've been amazed that like we can find something that works in Ghana, and then we are able to roll out a feature across different markets that like our team in Kenya is like immediately grabs it and makes it work for them. So I think we're getting a tremendous amount of leverage from this, and I never could have imagined doing this if I didn't have that experience from Zoona. So it was again like failing in order to win. It's like the ultimate failure, or my penultimate failure at Zoona that caused me to leave, ended up like being this platform to like launch a new business that never would have existed if I didn't have that experience. So I'm just actually very grateful for having lived through it and survived it.
So you experience also with investors lots of challenges in earlier startup experience, Zoona, which you also shared in the book. What did you do differently this time?
Yeah, continue to experience, Barak. Not all investors are as enlightened and as great as you have been. So thank you for your support. So the investor market has changed like so much. Like in the early days at Zoona, there was a few like literally I could count on one hand and name like the number of startups in Africa pursuing like, on the other hand, a very small handful of investors, right? And so there was no marketplace. And what it meant though is that you didn't have to go through this like pitch and rejection process. It was really genuine relationship building. So it was hard to like identify those investors, and I got really lucky through some introductions, but we were early adopters, but we found investors who were like interested in Africa, and they didn't have a conduit of how to put money in, and we were building a great business, right? So, but it took time for the deals to come together. And then in the later stage, it became very difficult because I think the big jump was going from like impact driven, but like very commercially savvy investors. Like there was almost a misnomer of like they're impact driven, so they don't care about making money. Like these were like proper fintech investors that, backed by the likes of people, eBay founders. And I had amazing exposure to a lot of coaching, and people like worked at PayPal, through the investor networks. But once we got into like the Series B, Series C stage, we kind of then were jumping into like private equity. And those investors are looking at like, what's your EBITDA, history over the last 24 months, and trying to sell them on the vision of what this business could become. We're a Zambian business becoming a digital bank for Africa, right? And we're doing this competing against telco-led mobile money, which was getting a lot of traction at the time. People were excited, but like ultimately that became a big challenge, and we were I think ahead of our time. And like our numbers were insane. Like we were making, $2 million a month of revenue. And I remember investors like saying like, oh, we're evaluation like at Series B, post Series B was $50 million. And people were saying like how expensive that was. 2021, you had Chipper Cash that was like 3-year-old business raised at $2 billion. And then suddenly that becomes the new anchor, right? So everything was very different and hard at those times. And you go into the book and there's like, I experienced a lot of the challenges, and every kind of investor, like really good, amazing, super helpful ones, really quite toxic, very unhelpful ones. And some that never became investors, like the one that pulled out of the round at the end. What's changed at Boost? So when I started Boost, like first there was COVID. So I had to like figure out, like due diligence went virtual, which was actually really helpful. because before COVID, if you believe this, it actually seems crazy now. I had 2 investors like for our pre-seed round that flew internationally to go to Ghana, where we were doing a pilot, and we had 5 customers. And I had to fly. I was living in Cape Town, and I had to fly there and meet them. And this was right before COVID. And they got there, and they were like, there wasn't really much happening because we were piloting, but like the vision was very clear. And it was hard to do. Like they did a week-long due diligence trip, like stupid, right? It's just like the amount of money. And then at the end, they're like, oh, we're not going to invest. Come back to us later. But it was really helpful that everything went global and went virtual. I found personally that it's probably a hard surprise, but like the investors I thought would come in that I knew very well didn't. But it was like almost the weak connections or the weak ties. Like the people one step removed from my network jumped in and backed me. And then once we had a couple in, we were able to do like a $500,000 like very early pre-seed like angel and small round in Q2 2020, like as lockdown was raging, and that got us off the ground. And then we had like this crazy period where suddenly Y Combinator enters into Africa. Post COVID, like the valuations skyrocket because it's a world of cheap capital. Everybody's doing crazy rounds, like at big valuations. And that ended up not helping us. I thought, I'm like, okay, this is going to be easy to raise money now. But we had some quite strong headwinds there. So first of all, I was now like living in like I'd moved to London. We launched remotely Ghana, South Africa, Nigeria. I had the structure and we had a team together and some early traction, but it was hard to compete with the narrative of like a fintech founder in Lagos who got into Y Combinator, right? And so many investors were piling into this industry for like the first time because Africa was hot, right? And it was like the next thing, and it was a big wave. But I was doing a lot of pitching to analysts of like funds straight out of business school, and and never heard of Zoona, like had no context of Africa, never invested in there. And it was just like, it was almost easy to say like, the companies in YC raising $30 million valuation with, pre-revenue, but they're on the ground and they're selling this like big story. It was like an easier pitch than, I'm in London and we're like launched in 3 markets and we're running this business remotely. And I also had a lot of challenge because there were some other companies in our sector that raised big rounds that were in the distribution and running very like asset heavy businesses. And even the ones that were proclaiming to be asset light were very people heavy, like hundreds of employees and sales forces, and showing like early revenue because they were like raising the money and then burning it on people and discounts to customers and like buying products and selling, at a discount as acquisition. Right. And so there were show big GMV numbers. And we had that as our model. We're very capital efficient. We're had a very different way of doing things. And if you kind of then like jump into the next phase of what happened, a lot of those businesses, but like all of those businesses actually are like probably hitting walls right now. Like many are collapsing. Very sadly, I don't think this is a good, even competition like builds the ecosystem and it drives innovation. And the market in Africa is so big and so untapped that I really think it's a bad thing for companies to go under. But like that's kind of happened. And now we've gone back to this world of like capital efficiencies back in vogue. Traction matters, path to profitability matters. And our business Boost is like amazingly well positioned for this now. And, we've never done a round of layoffs because we never overhired. We're in 6 markets. We've got a team of 27 people globally. Our tech team is still 2. So we're extremely light and lean, and like we've never done a down round. We've always been able to raise our valuation, and we've kind of done it in tranches. But what's also happened now is like the bigger name investors have withdrawn from Africa. And other ones that kind of are still in, like many of them have got burned from like being part of these big rounds, and then like it didn't materialize because the company raised too much money and burned through it too quickly, or there's some like bad cases too of companies that didn't like like raised huge seed rounds and then didn't have the licensing to do what they were even doing in fintech, right? And stuff that experienced founders on the ground are like, yeah, we kind of could have told you this. And that's that's the just the school fees I think people are paying for, like almost a go fast or growth at all costs mindset. So anyways, I've gone through like these waves, and like what I've been able to do, or what I should say we've been able to do at Boost, is build a community of really good solid investors, initially starting small tickets, but like with people who can actually add value to the business, and either through other investor connections or being like supporters, but like local investors on the ground who have very actively helped us open markets. We have two investors who's from Nigeria in their first round that actually got us a connection to Unilever and helped get our business off the ground. We've got investors in Egypt that actually helped us launch Boost Egypt into that market, and are playing an active role in the business. In every one of our markets, we kind of have stories like that. And we're now at the point where there's enough proof points and enough traction that we're now getting on people's radar. And this is what I've always wanted to achieve is, great businesses, they say, are bought and not sold. And it's the same with investors, right? It's like, if you get into the point where people want to invest in you and you're not chasing the money, then that's great. And and I think we're very close to being there. And the irony as a founder, all founders will tell you the same thing, is like when you actually no longer need the money, that's when everybody wants to give it to you. So we're pushing really hard where we want to be profitable, and then we can take the investors we want and kind of choose our own path. And then you also have like many different types of capital that are available to you as well. But I'm really kind of happy in hindsight. It was hard. Like it took me a few iterations of lots of pitches and lots of rejections, and kind of figuring this out, like this whole new world. I'm like in my middle ages now, so it was like no longer the young kind of pioneer doing this like in all by myself, like I was at Zoona. Now there's just like a sorting process where investors are like, okay, you got 20 minutes, like pitch to me. Sorry, this doesn't fit. On to the next call. Like, so that's very different now. But being able to kind of get through like and build a community of like really good, solid investors, and now use that as a network to start leveraging to the next phase. And that's where we are.
Mike, to coming to the end and wrapping up, are there any books or resources that especially founders or readers should be inspired from your approach lately, or even from your lifetime? Can you recommend some books?
Yeah. There's so many. Hey. And that's the great thing. Like now the plethora of information available on startups and entrepreneurships is amazing. So like, I always loved The Hard Thing About Hard Things. It's a bit of a classic now. One of the inspirations I had reading my book was, I was like, you know what, Ben Horowitz wrote that, but he was still like a billionaire, right? So he was like real failure, and he talked about it, but like he was still successful in the end, right? So I wanted to make failing to win, like same theme but different. But I think Multipliers is a brilliant book as well. Essentialism, that's really been influential for me. Essentialism is there's even this philosophy of how to do less with how to do more with less, right? And I think that's extremely useful. Multipliers is how to really unlock the productivity of your people, because often you get money and people are like, okay, I need to hire a team, but that's generally like one of the worst things you should do, because if you're only getting 50%, 30 to 50% capacity out of your people, then it will create more problems for you, right? So I think these things have been very influential for me. And one I read recently that I loved was Never Split the Difference, right? it's about negotiation, but it's really more a philosophy of life and how to embrace saying no and embracing conflict and like really getting into like psychology. And something, Barak, you write a lot about in your blogs, and I think like I always love reading your things because I think you share a lot of this ethos. So those are some that I would share.
So, Mike, last question: if you have the billboard entrance of the London with one message to share, what would you say it? Why?
Enjoy the ride and don't be afraid to fail.
Thank you, Mike, for taking time with me today. I wish you a great weekend.
Thank you, Barak.
Bye.